Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Youth Career Mentorship Program. I'm so glad to report that the number of our participants is growing and that this week, in addition to friends from the US, South America, Portugal, and Spain, we also have participants joining us from England and Israel. As a reminder, if you missed last week's presentations, they are already available on our website, sjcinitiative.org. Throughout this series, we have been learning how our talents and passions can be directed to the service of our communities, what principles should guide our work in order for this purpose to be fulfilled, how our work can build unity across cultures and peoples, and how work done in a spirit of service to others can unlock human capacity and release our creative powers. The presenters in this series have achieved excellence in their field of work and have applied their knowledge and expertise to address different types of social injustices and to advance inclusion and equity at the local and global levels. Today, we are honored to have with us Professor John Hatcher. Professor Hatcher received his bachelor's degree and master's in English literature from Vanderbilt University and his PhD in English literature from the University of Georgia. He is Professor Emeritus in English literature at the University of South Florida in Tampa, where he taught for 40 years. He has published 25 books and more than 100 poems and articles. His works have been translated into French, Spanish, Italian, Chinese, German, and Norwegian. His comparative study of theodicy, The Purpose of Physical Reality, The Kingdom of Names, published originally in 1987, is now in its fourth printing and was reviewed in the prestigious Encyclopédie Philosophique Universelle, a dictionary of the world philosophical works published by the Presse Universitaire de France, where he was listed as one of the 3 most important scholars in Baha'i studies for the 20th century. As Professor Hatcher goes through his presentation, I encourage you to type your questions in the chat box. He will go through some of these questions we will go through some of these questions in the second half of the session. And with that, I will give the floor to Professor Hatcher.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the lovely introduction, which I wrote myself. You'll never know whether it's true or not unless you do some research. I'm going to read some thoughts that I wrote down about the meaning and value of sacrifice, because all religions tout sacrifice as the highest form of serving God. But it's often misunderstood. And so what I wanted to do was to discuss a kind of sacrifice that I have found very important in the Baha'i writings and in my own experience. Because while the teachings and writings of the Baha'i faith can instill in us confidence and certitude and a reliable pathway to becoming a spiritually refined person, at times the same sacred text, like the sacred texts of many religions, seem calculated to make us feel guilty, as if nothing we can do will make us sufficiently worthy, especially when we read the Baha'i history and compare our lives and accomplishments with the incredible deeds of those who lived and sacrificed their lives in the heroic age of the Baha'i faith, or those who have since given up all they possess to become pioneers in remote regions where they endured physical and spiritual tests. Of course, there are a number of psychologists who portray religion as an adversary to good mental health, precisely because of the guilt it may induce. And guilt, when misunderstood, may be perceived as a needless impediment to good mental health and happiness. In this vein, in teaching youth over almost 50 years, I have often heard many of them, particularly I'm talking about Baha'i youth, lament that they did not live in the days of the heroic age, where the dawn breakers, as they were called, fought in battles, sacrificed their lives, and were totally detached from everything else except teaching and defending the Baha'i faith. Of course, with the renewed persecution of Baha'is in Iran since the 1979 revolution, we witness once more the fortitude and perseverance of the Baha'is in that same land, continue to endure imprisonment or deprivation of civil rights, and when they refuse to recant their faith, even execution. The same sort of sacrifice and dedication holds true for those who went pioneering during the 10-year World Crusade, which was from 1953 to 1963, leaving the comfort of their homes, the security of their professions, and the material ease of the American life to teach the faith in distant lands. And of course, not just Americans did this, but Baha'is all over the world. These courageous but often unheralded Knights of Baha'u'llah, as they became called, helped establish new spiritual assemblies, national spiritual assemblies, the institutions that would become the foundational pillars for the establishment of the Universal House of Justice, which these NSAs or National Assemblies elected in 1963 as the final building block of the Baha'i administrative order. But what about now? How can we, in our present circumstances, demonstrate that same degree of devotion and sacrifice? In this day, instead of being asked to give our lives or even to leave our homes, we are exhorted to build the skeletal framework for a global community by working with our own neighborhoods, or else by home front pioneering. While challenging and requiring the sacrifice of our time and energy, these endeavors might not seem heroic or sacrificial in the minds and hearts of those youth who are familiar with the exciting tales of figures like Tahireh, Qudus, Mullah Hussein, Qujat, Zainab, and Wahid, and so many others. In short, we may feel guilty that we can discover no obvious path to some sort of heroic sacrifice of our own. On the other hand, anyone who has spent hours and days studying the books in the Rui sequence of courses, and then applying the actions recommended for each of those increasingly more demanding levels of study, and committing ourselves to teaching others with those courses, as well as employing the other activities of what's called the Institute process, will doubtlessly discover over time that this service requires steadfast devotion, dedication of time and energy, and the same degree of sacrifice as would languishing in a prison or enduring a gruesome but quick execution. But of course, we cannot judge the value of one sort of sacrifice against another. Neither can we assess who has sacrificed most. After all, life is not a contest, and the evaluation of our efforts must be left to God alone, because only He, a being of infinite capacity, can weigh and evaluate all those obstacles, trials, and willful determination required for us to persist in spite of the challenges that any sort of service will ultimately encounter. So while it might seem an easy thing to pit the heroic endeavors of Mullah Hussein against the daily grind of establishing and maintaining children's classes, or serving as an animator for junior youth spiritual empowerment program, the sort of sacrifice and the value of the specific course of action required in one period of the progress of the faith may be just as valuable and as entirely different and ostensibly less dramatic form of sacrifice in another. Even as Abdul Baha noted, that the challenges and tests for the American Baha'i community would be mostly mental, not physical. And we can discuss what he meant by that if we have time. At the heart of sacrifice then is not a certain degree of what is sacrificed, a large amount of money versus a small amount of money, or the loss of one's life versus a lifelong service in your neighborhood. As story after story from the history of the faith demonstrates, the value of sacrifice is entirely dependent on the circumstances of the believer and the intent and attitude underlying the actions of the believer. Therefore, for those Baha'is sufficiently privileged to acquire a higher education, the question of service and sacrifice assumes a much more subtle matter of choices because you have more of them, especially since the most obvious course of action may not always be the best path in utilizing your skills and your talents. For example, we may believe the course of study we pursue or the profession we choose must have some obvious direct relationship to the service of others. We may conclude that obviously we should become a doctor or a nurse or a welfare worker rather than a businessman or insurance salesman or an artist or a farmer. And yet we are told the Creator has instilled in each one of us a special and unique array of skills, of capacities and desires. Therefore, before we dare venture out to make this major decision about the direction we should follow in our life, it is our foremost and sacred duty to investigate ourselves, to discover the gems of capacities concealed in the mind of our essential self, those gifts and skills of which we may not readily be aware, because each of us is unique. We must then polish and refine those gems that they may become worthy of bestowing on others in service to God and humanity. It is in this sense, excuse me, it is in this sense that sacrifice does not mean disposing of something that is precious to us, or foregoing life's joys to endure the drudgery of a vocation that we find tedious and unexciting. But when we consider the root of this word sacrifice, we discover that it is formed by the combination of two Latin root words, sacer, meaning sacred or holy, and facere, to make, thereby giving us the meaning underlying all other uses, to make sacred. Therefore, when we apply this concept to the choice of a profession or a course of action and try to discover how that pursuit will benefit ourselves and others, we actually want to find a method of utilizing our inherent talents and skills that will sanctify our lives, that will render our actions holy and sacred. In this sense, any skill or talent or profession we choose is a tool, and this tool has the potential to be used for selfish objectives or for the betterment of the human condition. It is up to us to discover how to apply this tool, this talent, our profession, so as to make it sacred, to employ it for sacred purposes. And this objective applies equally well to the artist, the carpenter, the mason, the lawyer, the nurse, the teacher, the good parent, or the kind neighbor. I still remember very well, some 50 years ago, when a lady of a highly respected concert pianist discovered and fell completely in love with the Baha'i faith. She loved Baha'u'llah and wanted to dedicate her life to the Baha'i faith. And indeed, she was so overwhelmed with the desire to serve Baha'u'llah, to demonstrate her dedication and devotion, that she felt impelled to make the greatest sacrifice she could think of. And to her way of thinking at the time, sacrifice meant pain, meant giving up that which she loved the most. She decided she would stop giving performances, stop playing the piano. Fortunately, there was in her community a wise Baha'i who told her, "We don't want you without your music. Your music is a service to us, to our hearts. It uplifts our souls." From that point on, she redoubled her devotion to her art so that the music might touch the hearts of hearers and attract their souls to the source of the love which was infused into every piece she played. She didn't give away her gift, but she sacrificed it by making it a spiritual gift in the service of others. But such vocational and professional choices do not come easily, not without study and rigorously considering our decisions. I recall in my own profession as an academic, several Baha'is who were faced with the choice of devoting their study to that which was popular in their field at the time, but instead chose to devote their research and their writing to exploring how the respective areas of research might illuminate or become illuminated by the Baha'i teaching. Some of those professors experienced disdain from their colleagues in the field, while others were praised for the innovative and creative application of their work. Most I know of were ultimately rewarded in some way, a bounty that Baha'u'llah often bestows upon those who make the hard choices of service and sacrifice. A few ended up with profound realization that only by making what seemed at the time to be a sacrificial choice could they have managed to achieve the goals they attained, nor could they have garnered the respect of others who were influenced by their insights. Finally, I leave you with 3 thoughts. First, sacrifice is a process of dedicating whatever special talents you have been given to a cause of greater value than the exaltation of yourself. Second, guilt is not evil. It is a message from your inner self to your conscious self. The message may be saying your actions are not in accord with your expectations. And if so, there are 3 possible responses to that guilt. First, you can raise the level of your actions to accord with your expectations. Second, you can lower your expectations. Or third, you can realize after careful examination and reflection that you're doing the very best you can. Thus, you pray for peace of mind as you go about sacrificing your time, your energy, your skills, and your life as best you know how, confident that God will assist every step you take if you always remain attentive to his guidance. Well, that took 21 minutes. I could have read it slower. So I'm ready to consider whatever questions you might have, or to re-explain or amplify any of the points that I hastily went over. But suffice it to say, the heart of what I was getting at is that sacrifice, as normally understood and talked about, is not the highest level of meaning of the word. It doesn't mean suffering. Suffering is and of itself not a good thing. It is sometimes necessary, but that's not the object of our life. In the medieval period, for example, flagellation by a monastic, beating of yourself and so on, suffering pain, being in solitude, which many of us are now experiencing with this pandemic, was supposed to be a good thing, where you cut off all socialization. This would make you spiritual. Well, I always say when talking about monasticism or asceticism by those who sometimes would go off into the mountains or dwell in caves and so on, a way of life that Baha'u'llah forbids, that how do we know that they were spiritual if they were never tested? And the main example I give is if they never have children, how do we know they can ever demonstrate the virtue of patience? Well, that's all I have to say up front. Let me see if any of you have questions that I might be able to deal with. They don't have to be directly related to what I said. They can be very tangentially related, if you wish.
Thank you so much, Professor Hatcher. So I invite our participants to type your questions in the question and answer box. Sorry, I initially said in the chat box. I didn't mean the chat box, the question and answer box that is at the bottom of your screen. So Professor Hatcher, so if we understood correctly, so sacrifice is not, is it something that we seek or do we let it find us? It's one of the questions.
I'll take the easy way out. It's both. I would say this, you don't seek sacrifice per se, but you seek to challenge yourself to do the very best you can in whatever finely considered objective you have, and sacrifice will inevitably be a part of it. So if I want to be, as I tried to be, a very good teacher, I may not have gone in it to sacrifice myself, but if I did a good job, I had to sacrifice the time and energy to do well a very difficult job, whether it was trying to improve someone's writing or trying to explain to them the ideas in a novel or a classical work. Sacrifice is an inevitable part of anything we try to do well. On the other hand, you do have explicit statements in the Baha'i writings about that, for example, giving to the fund, which is something we do anonymously and of our own free will. No one is overseeing what we do, or we're told to give sacrificially. Well, if no one knows what we're giving, if it's a private and personal act, then how do we know if it's sacrificial? Well, that's up to you to decide. What's sacrificial for one person may be a nickel. What's sacrificial for another may be $1 million. But obviously it has the implication of something that tests you, something that's going a little bit beyond what is comfortable. So that's why both answers are correct, that some things you set out to do sacrificially, something that tests you. Other things, as I say, that you try to do well, sacrifice will be an inevitable concomitant of that endeavor.
Another question, thank you so much. I'm Nikita from Barbados, studying an International Masters of Peace. To what degree has the indoctrination of the masses by Hollywood and social media obliterated all sense of sacrifice insofar as it has redefined what our value systems are? It has defined the things to which we render as higher or spiritual service.
Well, of course, the answer is implicit in the question, isn't it? The questioner is obviously indicting Hollywood and materialist and sensualist oriented society. And I think it's a very correct assessment. I would say how much, I would say virtually completely. So that even as Baha'is, we are, as the writings say, not beyond the temptation of material well-being, of where the concept of sacrifice is often challenging because we want to live comfortably. We want our children to have the best education possible. That's why this pandemic is such an interesting, I guess insurance companies would say it's an act of God, like a hurricane or a tornado. But as a Baha'i, I see it as perhaps an act of God, which has a more benefit in the sense of taking away from us those our freedom to do whatever we want. Since you're talking in an American context about Hollywood as opposed to Bollywood or whatever culture you live in, I would say that the inability to, well, I guess one of the best passages in this regard is one in Gleanings from Baha'u'llah, where he says that freedom, when taken to an extreme, is not really freedom. It becomes licentiousness. That true freedom is the abiding by the law of God, because the law of God is not restrictive. It is, when you understand it correctly, the easiest path for you and the most rewarding. So some things are like the lifestyle we see of the rich and famous, or would seem to be what we would long for. And yet it's kind of interesting that I think one of the, perhaps the only good service that these periodicals on grocery store checkout shelves teach us about the sad lives of the rich and famous and the tragedies they're enduring, are really there to let us know that you really, that's really not enough. It's really not going to save you. And they get divorced and have tragedies too, as if to say, it's okay, you don't have to have that. Jim Carrey, a comedic actor that probably most people are familiar with, has gone through a very serious period in his life. And he said that he wishes everyone could experience what he has, namely fame, success, immediate riches, and recognition, because then they would see that this is not the answer, that this is not a path to happiness. So I spoke too much there, but hopefully that gets a little bit at the point. We could discuss that for forever, how our society is toxic. Anyone who's tried to raise a child in this society, even with a very strong Baha'i home, can tell you that where you want society, here, I do feel the need to say this, society is our most powerful teacher, whether we want it to be or not. And as a parent, you would hope society would reinforce the values you have and help teach your children. In this day, a parent has to protect the child from society because almost every value society has to impose on the child is detrimental to that child's advancement.
Thank you, Professor Hatcher. Another question. The highest level or highest meaning of a word can also be called the heart of a word. Is it possible to reach the heart or the highest course of action within a profession? Could this mean for each person there is only one highest course of action within a profession or your calling?
It depends on whether you're talking about in the eyes of the profession or in the eyes of your own standards. I think it's a more subtle question than it might first appear. In my own profession, I reached what to me was satisfactory, though in the eyes of my profession, I had achieved nothing. But I was quite happy and quite pleased with what I did and what I accomplished. You're never finally satisfied if you go by your own standards as a Baha'i and what you're told, because you're told that there is no end point, that any virtue is endlessly perfectible. Therefore, there's no such thing as perfection in any single virtue, much less the combination of virtues we are taught to attain. And therefore, you can always go further, whether in this life or the next. But according to your profession, there may be some highest level where you are recognized, whether it's a Fulbright scholarship or a full professorship, and so on. Those turn out to be, in my point of view, very hollow, ultimately. very hollow. And I can, in fact, that's one of the things that turned me into a writer about the Baha'i faith, is that I realized very early in my career that the reward I would receive were I to attain the heights of accomplishment in my profession would be the praise of people that I really had no regard for. I don't mean I disdained them. They were just not people I'd want to spend a Saturday night with or have dinner with. Or have as my best friends. That those were of a different character, and so I decided that I would devote myself to writing about the Baha'i faith because I loved it, I enjoyed it. So I guess that's the answer. It depends on what standards you use as to whether there is a highest point of achievement and of course, from a personal point of view, there is none. Even if you're totally materialistic, there is none. As you notice, the richest people we know of want to get richer. Why is that? Because it's insatiable. The desire for material wealth and well-being, for power and recognition. It's insatiable. It eats you alive. All right. Whereas when you are doing the best you can in service to others, you may feel that there's always more you can do, but at some point you realize this is as much as I can do. And it's a very wise point of reflection in your daily life and in your weekly life is as you assess yourself, you take yourself into account each day, that you don't overburden yourself. You have to be as kind to yourself as you would be to your best friend and say, self, you're doing too much, which means you're going to do a lot of things poorly and you need your rest and so forth. And here again, the word sacrifice comes into play.
So also part of her question, Professor Hatcher, is this one, do you see that the way you look at it, can we have multiple callings, multiple courses of action that, or can we find, this is also related to somebody else's question, is how can we determine what are our special talents? So is there one path that we should look for, or can we have multiple callings, multiple courses of action?
It depends on what conclusions you reach after you examine yourself. That's why I said in my talk, the first thing we have to do, we're told in the writings that man is a mind rich with gems, and the purpose of the educator, the manifestation, is to help us discover those gems hidden in that mind and polish them and refine them. This is why teaching, especially early teaching of the child or the youth, is so important, that they have the freedom to experiment. I know in my generation, it was very common, especially for males, because the female was going to be presumed to be a housewife. We were far enough advanced where she wasn't condemned if she became a doctor or chose a profession. But the main expectation was that this was a man's decision to make. What pathway would he choose? And I would say at least 50% of the males that were in my generation followed the path of their fathers, either because the father had established a business that was left to the son to maintain and expand, or else because particularly with professions like lawyers, doctors, and so on. I can't tell you how many of those I knew that where the father was in the same profession. We all have, on the one hand, a variety, an array of talents and skills. And so we need to explore them. I would say the first thing one should look for is that talent or skill which combines a certain array of requirements. The first and foremost, from my point of view, is that it makes you happy, is that you find joy in what you're doing. I knew I wanted to be a teacher when I was 10 years old and helped an 8-year-old learn how to ride a bike. And that was just an incredible experience for me. When I was through, I realized, I don't think on a conscious level I could have articulated it, but I realized, or I felt the joy in giving to someone this intangible gift, a skill. So I always knew I wanted to teach. That one experience began my understanding of it, and every subsequent experience of imparting an understanding or a skill confirmed it. The only thing I needed to know then, okay, what do you want to teach? And then I went through a whole nother process of examination and trying about 3 different areas of teaching that interest me. And again, I could go into detail about how I ended up going into English, but it would take a while. I don't think there is one path insofar as what your skills, but I mean, there's what the concept, which is pretty much gone nowadays, of the Renaissance man. And of course, now we would say the Renaissance person, because a woman is expected to achieve as much as a man, or should be. And the concept of the Renaissance person is one who is adept in many things, who knows literature, who's familiar with music. Doesn't mean they know how to do all these things, but they are aware of an array of skills, talents, the arts, the sciences, and so on. This gives you a good idea of where you want to put your energy, what profession, what subject interests you. So that's the first thing. Do you find joy in it? And the second thing, of course, as a Baha'i, if at all possible, you want something that serves others. But any profession can do that if you exercise it in the correct way. As I said in the talk, the obvious ways are things that are directly serviceable to mankind. Being a doctor, a nurse, we're seeing that so much now with this pandemic. And we talked about the heroes on the front line. They're not the Hollywood heroes that we were speaking of a few minutes ago. There are the people you wouldn't take a second look at in ordinary circumstances in daily life, nor are they the people that make the most money or the most celebrated. We celebrate them now because we see their true value. But they knew the value of what they did before this happened. That's why they got into it. Maybe not solely to serve, but because it interested them. So those 2 things are foremost. Do you enjoy it? Is it sufficient unto you to make you satisfied? I know, for example, I have interest in painting and sculpture and so on, and I love to do these other things. And athletics, I loved being competing in athletic events. I know Dr. Rue, who was on the first Universal House of Justice. No, I think he was elected later, but at any rate, a very fine physician, very well noted physician, but he was an artist as well, and a very good artist. So I hope that I'm just talking around it, but I guess the point is, do what you enjoy. You should have avocations, and those avocations are as important as your vocation. because they balance out your life. I guess that's it on that one.
Thank you. Professor Hatcher, you know, there are a few other questions, but personally, my personal questions is how can you talk a little bit about how the arts serve the best interests of humanity? You know, how artists are, can you explore a little bit this relationship between the arts, poetry, writing, painting, music?
Yeah, there's an article I wrote in a book, the name of which I can't remember, but that deals directly with that. And I can't even remember the name of the article right now. But the arts serve us in many ways. The artist, the simplest analogy I used when I was teaching poetry in both the graduate and undergraduate level was because I would raise this question: why poetry? What does it matter? And one metaphor I used was, I said that the artist is like the kinesthetic receptors out in the world. And a kinesthetic receptor is that part of your autonomic nervous system. I think it's autonomic, but it tells you where you are in time and space. Not time so much, but it's a spatial thing. I know where my hand is because I can see it, but if I couldn't see it, I would know where it was. Well, the artist tells you where you are, and he tells you where you are, or she tells you where you are, long before society has come to realize where it is. And so that's usually why they're disdained, because they're making you feel uncomfortable with the mirror image they're throwing back at you. They say, you may think you look like this, but here's what you really look like. And of course, that would be a visual art. Well, the poet does the same thing. So I would say that's one thing, is the artist is sort of like a scout on a hunting trip, is out ahead of us, warning us of what is to come, warning us of what we've already been, or reminding us of what we've been through, and cautioning us about the danger of where we are and what we're likely to do if we don't change. And that's true. And of course, there are other virtues of the art. It uplifts the spirit. It's a ladder, of course, is the image used in the Baha'i writings, especially with music, that it is a ladder to the soul. It uplifts the soul. But it can unleash all kinds of other emotions too. So it keeps us in touch with our emotions, and our emotions keep us in touch with how we're doing. And that gets back to what I was talking about in the talk about guilt. Do you feel guilt? Well, is that a bad thing? No, it's simply information. Is it valid? I don't know. Let me see why I feel guilty. And so you have to reflect. So you either, as I said, you raise your action to accord with your expectations, or you say, well, I'm asking too much of myself, or somebody else is imposing what I should do on me, and I reject that. I know what I can do. And sometimes the nerve is broken. So you may feel something, in other words, that's where you need to get some therapy, because your emotions are out of whack with reality. They're not giving you correct information. Right? Again, that's an endlessly useful topic. And the best way to do it is examine the foremost artists in every field, in every type of art, and see why are they valuable. And some of them, I would say, are not. Some of the most celebrated artists, I would say, I don't get it. So a lot of it's very subjective.
Thank you, Professor Hatcher. Another question is, Thank you for your presentation. He says, a simple but still deep question. What sacrifice that you have witnessed or felt or done has marked you profoundly, and why? What were the positive impacts of this sacrifice?
It depends on whether you're talking about the sacrifice of others or my own sacrifice. I was very fortunate to be taught the faith by my brother, who was 5 years older than I, and who married Judith Hatcher, who was Judith Bernstein before she was married. And they were incredible models of what the Baha'i life was about for me. They went pioneering to Switzerland, to Russia, to Canada. Of course, now Canada would be a lovely place to just to go to get away from America. Excuse me for saying that, but at any rate, so my brother sacrificed by pioneering and demonstrated that for me. My mother and my father were both incredible models for me. They established a standard for me. They weren't Baha'is until my mother became a Baha'i when she was 96. And she knew what she was doing. She had really wanted to be a Baha'i much longer than that, but she couldn't pull herself away from her friends who were in the Methodist Church. And finally, when they all died, she realized she had nothing to hold her back, no one who would fuss at her. And so she told me when I was visiting her one day, I guess I'm really a Baha'i. She said this after she had been teaching a bunch of people the Baha'i faith, as she always did, ever since we became Baha'is, my brother and I. She started teaching the faith. And I said, yeah, I guess you are. Would you like to become one officially? And she said, yes, I would. So at 96, she became a Baha'i and a dedicated one. I love picking up the books she had. Her gleanings has as much of her writing in it as it does about Baha'u'llah. On the margin, she has cross references to the Bible and to all these other sources. So she not only read, but she read rigorously and studiously and sacrificially. My father's sacrifice was in very subtle ways. He was an incredible, dedicated manager of a business. And he was kind and just to those who worked under him. He was beloved by them. He was totally unselfish and so on. These were models of sacrifice for me. And of course, when I read the Dawnbreakers and so on, I realized the other levels of sacrifice. I could not believe that these things literally happened in people who were perpetrated by people who could call themselves human beings in any important way. And I really thought that these were mythical, that this really didn't happen this way. But of course, in the Dawnbreakers, Shoghi Effendi has given us footnotes to substantiate the veracity of all these events. So I forget the question now, but it had something to do with what sacrificed and was important to me, or modeled sacrifice for me. And I have to say, when I made my decision to turn down the challenges and accolades that might come with pursuing this particular aspect of English literature I was in, which was medieval literature, that's a whole nother story, and focus on the Baha'i faith, that was kind of daring. And so I realized that I cared more about, it's about value system, that ultimately the opinion of others amounts to very little when you reflect on your life. It's what you think of yourself in light of the Baha'i standard, the mizan.
Professor Hatcher, you know, how as a parent, how do we, because of the value system that is in society, as you said, you know, and how we try to protect our children, as a parent, how would you teach the beauty of sacrifice to your kids? I mean, if you could give us with you know, and with that we'll conclude the session. But as a parent of young children or youth, can you give us, yeah,
How do I teach them about sacrifice?
the beauty and the value of, well, you told us about the value of sacrifice, but can you summarize a couple of points? Yes, how would you teach them?
How to teach them to guard them against the negative influences we've mentioned about society? Is that what you're
to
getting at?
value sacrifice, to value sacrifice.
Well, let me say up front that one of the painful realizations of a parent is when you realize that the child is a person unto him or herself, and that ultimately they have free will, and that ultimately their choices are their own, that you cannot, that the failure of a child is not necessarily an indictment of the parent. That a child can choose the wrong thing and never understand what you're talking about. The first thing my wife and I did was to homeschool our children. Now, I'm not recommending this as the be all and end all. We would have preferred to have them in a school that had values, that taught values. But we could find none. And well, mainly we couldn't find a school that taught anything that basically we realized very quickly that we could do a better job of educating our children than what was being done in the school. And we could do it quicker, and we could have them accelerate at their own pace, and they had more free time that way. So the whole socialization we gave them was through outside activities. My daughter went into dance, became very good at dance. My son was an incredible athlete. But sacrifice, you know, the very best way, and I forget whether it's Bill Sears that says this, or it may have been, I think, Fazey, Hand of the Cause Fazey says this in one of his talks, that one of the best things to do is read the lives of those who sacrificed. Read the stories of the heroes and heroines of the faith. They need these models because they don't have them in their own life. And of course, exemplifying it in your life as a parent is the very best thing you can do. But in teaching, these stories have such a lasting and enduring influence that I think that's we don't do this enough. We think history is, why study what happened? I want to know what's happening now and what's gonna happen. Well, history, we're exhorted in the writings to study the Baha'i history, and not just Baha'i history, but history in total. And that's one of the best things is have them study the lives of those who accomplished things because they did sacrifice. And of course, I could rattle off names of heroic figures, Gandhi, Mother Teresa, others who weren't Baha'is, Madame Curie, and so on. So those are the first two things that come to our mind is exemplify it in the home. And another thing is, and this is very important and it's very difficult, to do in this day. Have them take on responsibilities as early as possible, where they have to earn, whether it's money or privileges. You know, we read this axiom throughout the writings: the greatest educator is reward and punishment. And we think of punishment as something wicked and evil, as awful. And yet the writings say punishment is a teacher. Well, of course, they're not talking about physical punishment, but insofar as raising a child is concerned, they have to feel the results of negative action. So that's a skill in itself. That's something worth writing a lot of books about. Creative punishment. It sounds crazy, but I've always thought that someone needs to write about creative or punishment that teaches. So I guess I babbled enough about that.
So friends, Professor Hatcher, thank you so much. We have almost hold you here for an hour. It has been a wonderful presentation. Thank you for so graciously answering our questions. And I would like to remind the friends that this presentation has been recorded, will be available on our website. And next Thursday, we will meet with Layli Miller-Muro, and she will be talking about stepping out of our comfort zone. So thank you again, Professor Hatcher.
My very great pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.